Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. I've cracked out the poetry bag yet again. We'll be talking poetry for the next hour or so. I don't think poetry publishers really go in for book bags. Maybe Bloomsbury ought to send me one because I will be talking to one of their poets. But we're also talking about a very exciting anthology that has just come out. Please welcome into the book bag, Sally Reid. Morning,
Hello.
Sally. Hello.
Morning.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Now, you divide your time, don't you, Sally? But I believe you are in the UK at present.
I am, and I actually, I've only just begun to divide my time again because of family reasons. So I'm in England more than I used to be, but I'm basically based in Rome.
Yes, lovely Rome, marvellous place to be based. Now, the book that we will largely be discussing is the latest, this absolute wonderful whopper that I have been enjoying. Oh, look how big it is. 100 Great Catholic Poems, a mighty feat of editing and condensation. But I've also got several of your own collections here. So we'll be talking about basically your poetic journey. I'm very interested in that, and other journeys too, maybe. But okay, let's start with this. And I know that you've been working on it for a fair few years because you have mentioned it. I'm just fascinated by how you narrowed it down. I mean, right at the beginning, you have an intro. And you explain your working and your thoughts, and you sort of define great, and you define Catholic. But interestingly, I found that you also really had to think about what is a poem in terms of what to put in.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't years. It was just over a year. It was really short.
It feels like years.
Yeah, exactly. And it was very intense. I mean, it was absolutely more than full time, you know. And yes, I did think that the only way to approach it was to define my terms, because I had a remit. You know, they came to me. I didn't go to them. So the publisher Word on Fire came and said, we want this anthology of great Catholic poetry, and because they're a religious publisher, they specifically wanted Catholic. So it wasn't like I could sort of think, oh, that's quite Catholic actually, or for instance, Toni Morrison wrote some lovely religious poetry, and she was a Catholic, but she rejected Catholicism, so I couldn't put her in. So I had a framework to go with, which made it, in a sense, I mean, at first I thought, oh my goodness, I was overwhelmed. I thought, how will I do this? But it did make it easier, because I think with any anthology, it doesn't matter what the kind of category of identity you're dealing with, if you've got a line to draw, it's going to be controversial, but it makes a shape. If you don't have a line, then it can be just anything, you know. So as it happened, I think it made it more interesting. But equally, as you say, like I had to literally think about, well, what is a poem? Because there were certain things I wanted to put in, which people will argue about, like St. Augustine, because St. Augustine did write some poetry before his conversion, but it's largely been lost, and it's just fragments that remain. But of course, some of his confessions the passages are so poetic in Latin that the argument is that they really surpass genre, you know. And if you don't put in "Late have I loved thee," then you're doing a disservice to Catholic literature.
There's some very early stuff in the book. You did decide not to include living poets at all.
Again, that was something. Yeah, originally we were going to, at the very beginning, I was going to do that, and then we sort of thought, well, several reasons. One is that, you know, poetry has to stand the test of time, and it doesn't matter how good we think somebody is at the moment. Who knows after their death where they'll be, you know. And there's also the prickly fact of, if you do include a Catholic poet into what hopefully will be an enduring anthology, if they then sort of rip up a picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live, it rather spoils your anthology, you know. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm glad, because I can imagine if it was being published now and I had put in living poets, I think it would be a nightmare. because all the poets who are Catholic, because we're a little community, or quite a big community, it would all be like, well, why didn't you put me in? And it just would have been a nightmare. So I think it's actually quite nice that they're all dead.
Was there a little bit of kind of dealing with estates and copyright?
Hugely, which I thought, most of them would be public domain, but as it turned out, I think most of them aren't public domain because they come from all over the world, and because even the very, very early ones, even if they're English, they're Old English or Middle English, so somebody's had to translate them. And so that means that there was an awful lot of permissions work to do, which thankfully I didn't have to do, because if I had to do that, it would have been another year, I think.
So who had to go in when you started? I mean, I can think of at least one name where, he had to be in.
Would that be Dante? Would it?
That would be Dante. We have had Dante discussions in the past.
Yeah. So Dante had to go in because he is that is the best Catholic poem of all time. We can argue that, but I think that's probably true. And then there are ones that the Catholic literary world would require, which is Gerard Manley Hopkins, and I think he's the best English language Catholic poet that we have personally. And then who else had to go in? G.K. Chesterton would be a requirement. Newman, absolutely Newman. Yeah. There were quite a lot that were just no-brainers, and my job was to make sure that certainly I got all the no-brainers in there.
and some interesting choices and surprises along the way. There are a fair few saints. I venture to say there are more saints than in the average poetic anthology.
Well, that's the interesting thing too, is that lots of the people in the book aren't poets primarily. There are other things, like Teresa of Avila was a nun and a Carmelite reformer who had mystical experiences, but she wrote about the fact that when she had a mystical experience, she felt the power of God move her to write a poem. So they were kind of infused poems. So I mean, that's interesting. And St. John of the Cross too, whose poetry is among the best in the Spanish language. I mean, he was a religious. He wouldn't have said, "Oh, I'm a poet." He wasn't like a career poet,
But there's something, I think you touch on this in the introduction, there is something about poetry that sort of is sacred, whether we choose to think of it like that or not.
Yeah, and I've always thought that, because I used to be an atheist, and I think that when I was an atheist, poetry was my kind of religion, because it does sort of sanctify experience. And the way that it does that from a secular perspective is that if something's very painful or very ragged or we can't make sense of it, then poetry makes sense of it and beautifies it, not in a sort of a cliched way, but in a very, hopefully a very intelligent way, and a way that gives meaning to what's going on. Truth is beauty.
Your collections, which I have here. So the first one is The Point of Splitting. Then we have Broken Sleep. These are all Blood Acts, and The Day Hospital. So they range from 2005 to 2012, I believe. And it seemed to me, rereading some of those poems, is that you always were a very physical poet. And a lot of the poems in the great Catholic collection that you have, there's a lot of physicality, and I'm sort of intrigued by that, certainly in terms of your own religious journey and thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I have always been a very physical poet, and as a person, I'm very physical in the sense that I somatize. So, I always get kind of, the classic one was that when I was doing my master's, I got a big bump on my head because I was studying so much. I always have a kind of physical manifestation of what's going on, and that's very Catholic, which I didn't realize. But Catholicism is all about making the invisible visible, and so we have the Eucharist, which is the flesh of Christ. So we're not content with just kind of having Christ as a in the form of the Holy Spirit. We need something kind of concrete, and all the signs in churches, like the incense rising on the altar, that represents prayer. So everything becomes very visible as far as we can make it visible, or that the rite will allow. Yeah, so I think that is interesting, and that's why so many of the poems in the collection in the anthology are physical, because Catholicism is such a physical faith.
Can you talk a little bit about when you did convert? Because I believe you went sort of right from atheism to believing. And you've written about that. You have written about that transformation in your life as well.
That book, Night's Bright Darkness, deals with that time. And so it was 2010, and I just moved to Rome fairly recently, and was completely atheist and really loathed the Catholic Church. And really, I mean, it was especially at that time because the abuse stories were coming out, and it was just horrific. And I think this is not coincidental, I was becoming very disillusioned with poetry, because I felt that contemporary poetry was very kind of limited and self-limiting. And there was this idea that, especially I think in English poetry at that point, you couldn't talk about stuff that wasn't concrete and that wasn't physical. Anything that kind of went beyond the everyday was really poo-pooed and, shunned. And I felt that it was just constricting. And also there was maybe things have changed, I don't know, but it felt like there was not a lot of music in the poetry. I think there's been a return to form, and I'm personally not much of a formalist. I'm very free verse in what I write, but although my free verse has its own form, but I think we lost an awful lot. I think people kind of jumped on the free verse bandwagon, and they didn't know that still meant searching for a particular kind of music. It still has to be very, very tight, and it has to be, lovely to the ears. It has to be memorable. So I was feeling very frustrated. And at that point, I decided to write this non-fiction book about women's sexuality with a doctor friend of mine. And I was going to look at issues like abortion and contraception and all the rest of it. And I wanted to interview women from right across society, from atheists to Jewish women to Muslim women, etc. And I wanted to interview Catholic women, but none of them would talk to me. And I had lots of Catholic friends because I was living near to Rome, and they were very open about their natural family planning and all the rest of it. But when I said I wanted to interview them for a book, they just wouldn't talk. And so eventually I was introduced to this priest who was very kind of intelligent and seemed very accessible. And so I wrote to him, and I literally wrote, dear Father, I'm writing a book about the vagina, can you help me? And I was deliberately being, provocative, and I was kind of getting a bit frustrated. But he did write back and was really funny, actually. And we started up this conversation, and we ended up arguing a lot about the church. And from there, so that was in the March of 2010. And I had a series, I had 3, what I would term kind of mystical experiences, really, really strange experiences. And the last one, by the last experience, I actually believed in God, but I didn't understand what kind of God. And in the last experience, I had this kind of experience of Jesus Christ coming to me in a church, which was really dramatic and completely life-changing. And that was in the May. And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm definitely a Christian, but I was like, I don't want to be a Catholic. But through that summer, I read voraciously and was kind of trying to figure out what to do. And by the end of the summer, I knew that I had to be Catholic. And then I was received into the church in the December. So it was a 9-month conversion from beginning to end. So it was absolutely hair-raising and upsetting, in a sense, to my family and friends who didn't know what on earth had happened. And it changed a lot. I mean, it changed an awful lot.
I mean, you're very enthusiastic now, tweeting and things like that, Are you still as happy as you were? Happier, maybe?
I am. I mean, I really am. I mean, by nature, I'm very dark and pessimistic and miserable. That's never going to change. But no, it really does change things, because I feel that it's made me a lot less anxious. I'm still an anxious person, but I'm a lot less anxious, and I'm a lot more just stable and a lot happier, actually. And I don't know. It's interesting. I think the thing is with me is that poetry's always been central to who I am. It's not like I can live my life and then think, oh, well, I'll write about birds. whatever I write about is what's obsessing me at the time. So, of course, when I converted, I immediately started writing stuff about religion and about the faith and about my experiences. So you can't really split the two things up.
Just to go back to when you mentioned free verse, there's a poem that I loved very much in this book, which is by Thomas Merton. And again, he's not known as a poet, but it is a really beautiful piece of writing. Is he somebody that you were already interested in?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's amazing. He was a convert, and he published a very famous book called The Seven-Story Mountain about his conversion, and which was a huge bestseller in, I think, the 1950s. And it spawned, hundreds of vocations of young men becoming priests, because he's a very gifted writer, and he wanted to be a writer before he became a monk and then a priest. And when he went into the monastery, he, as with so many of our poets, he thought to himself, well, I should stop writing. Now that I'm a religious, I shouldn't write anymore because it's too much, it's too egocentric. But his superiors persuaded him that he should write. And so he wrote many kind of spiritual books about the contemplative life, which are really good. And he wrote masses of poetry. And I think he's phenomenally good. Yeah.
And again, it has a musicality, but it has its own form. But you've got the whole gamut here, really. You've also got very formal poems. What was the story with Gerard Manley Hopkins? Was he a convert? Was he? I don't really know much about him apart from the famous.
Yeah, poems. He was Anglican, and his family were very Anglican, and he I believe went to Oxford and converted under Newman and became Catholic. And when he went into the Jesuits, he was writing poetry, but like Thomas Merton, he thought that he should not write anymore, so he burned all of his poems and didn't write for, I think, about 7 years. And then whilst he was staying in Wales, there was a terrible shipwreck of this German boat with all these nuns on board, and he wrote the Wreck of the Deutschland. That's right. Yeah. And at that point, I think his superior said, you should write. And then he had this blazing summer where he wrote his most famous sonnets, which were I've got several in the book. As Kingfishers Catch Fire and God's Grandeur, Pied Beauty, although Pied Beauty isn't in there. But anyway, several amazing sonnets. They were called the Bright Sonnets, because like me, he was a bit of a kind of dark character in many ways. So eventually he went to Ireland and was very depressed, and his writing changed, was equally stunning, but it kind of changed and became darker before he died. So
quite young. He died quite young, didn't he? Yes.
Yeah. So he's really, really fascinating, and his use of language. I think in many ways he was almost the first modernist, because his use of language,
rhythm.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and the way he would have all these compound nouns and change verbs isn't to be nouns and all the rest of it. Really, really innovative. I mean, even now, just it reads incredibly innovative.
We studied the Wreck of the Deutschland for A level, which was really very challenging. I mean, I don't know how many teenagers would read that now, but to be honest, I'm glad to have done it.
It's kind of heretical, but I'm not a big fan of that particular poem. I think his form was the sonnet. That's really what he was called to do. And but I can't criticize Hopkins, or his body of work is amazing. But how you can see what they're meant to be heading for, and the sonnets are just amazing.
Did the Reformation mean that there was a rupture in how you thought about English poetry? Because, for example, I mean, I would classify John Donne as an amazing religious poet, but he doesn't really fit, does he? He doesn't.
No, I think he was.
Milton,
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, Milton wasn't so difficult, because if you compare Milton with Dante, it's just so staggeringly obvious which one's the Catholic. It's such a very different take on religion. So Milton wasn't hard to leave out, but John Donne was hard to leave out. But that was a line, when I'd drawn my lines, you were either one side or the other, and he did reject the faith. I mean, but I agree. And it was also very hard to leave out T.S. Eliot, because the four quartets are incredible. And he was so Catholic, but he made that decision that he wanted to remain an Anglican for many mysterious reasons, or perhaps not so mysterious. He was such an Anglophile, wasn't he?
And well, let's get on to Shakespeare. who is here? But what did you choose and why?
I thought you were going to say, who is he?
Oh no, I'm very man from Stratford.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had to have him because, and I do, as I say in the introduction, I'm not arguing that he was Catholic or not, because I'm not a historian, right? And you have to do a lot of research about all of that stuff. And of course, there are books that say he was, that are very, very, very persuasive. And I'm sure there are books that say that he wasn't, that are equally persuasive. I haven't read them, but I'm sure they exist. But to me, the work is just so very Catholic, especially Hamlet. So I really had to have something from Hamlet, because there's just so much about, the ghost coming back, and there's so much about purgatory, and there's, as I say in the introduction, there's so much about about not being able to go to confession before you die, and not being able to receive the Eucharist before you die, which for Catholics now and for people generally back then would have in recent memory been so incredibly important. If you die without going to confession at that point, then you're basically condemned to hell, or at least purgatory. So that there's so much kind of embedded in the text that I felt it was really important. So Hamlet was a kind of no-brainer for me. And of course, trying to pick the speech is always tricky. But and it's actually prose. It's a prose poem. I presented it as I have of late, that one, and it's about man's place within the hierarchy of the world and the supernatural hierarchy of angels, and that's Catholic theology. Thomas Aquinas's ladder of being, where you've got kind of slugs and snails and cellular organisms at the bottom, going all the way up through man, all the way up to angels and archangels, and up to God. So that seemed to be just very indicative of a Catholic mindset.
I don't think that speech has ever been better delivered than at the end of Withnell and I, weirdly enough, by Richard E. Grant, who just sort of delivers it to the wolves right at the very end. It's a wonderful moment. I mean, I think with Shakespeare, he's so much on the cusp that, Peter Ackroyd has argued this, hasn't he? That the Catholicism is this sort of buried river or underground river, that it can't be sort of washed away or diverted. It is here. And certainly during the times. I mean, I think Shakespeare's father, wasn't he a recusant, or didn't he have to pay fines for not going to church?
Apparently there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it was a Catholic family that he was from. And I think in any case, Catholicism and the issue of Reformation was so alive in the country. And if you're a poet like Shakespeare, of which there was nobody else, you really are taking on board that consciousness, the consciousness of a nation. And so it's got to be there, and it is there, So, and I went with the kind of Ted Hughes's genius and the crazy book, Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being, which, and I think, I do think that's true, where he says that, the suppression of the feminine, that's what the tragedies are all about in Shakespeare. It's a very, very complicated theory, but I thought that it was true what he was saying, and I feel there is something in Shakespeare that's reacting against suppression.
Alexander Pope is a great example of somebody who was Catholic and an absolutely brilliant poet. What about Dryden? Because he's in there. Was he a Catholic poet?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a convert, and it was a massive scandal, because he worked for Oliver Cromwell and wrote this kind of really laudatory poem about Cromwell and was all, up Cromwell. And then when Cromwell died, then he published The Hind and the Panther, which was basically his apologia, his defense of the Catholic faith and converted, and was really ridiculed for it. And The Hind and the Panther is actually a very controversial poem because I couldn't put lots of it in because he's so rude about other denominations. He casts like every denomination as an animal. And so the Hind is the Catholic Church and the Panther is the Anglican Church, and they go through them all. And I think there's a boar and various other things, but it's quite rude. So I had to take the bits that were useful and kind of quite beautiful. But it was very difficult, obviously, to convert at that time. And Alexander Pope as well was really ridiculed and hounded. And you couldn't live within London at that time, and you couldn't do certain things, and you couldn't go to various universities if you were Catholic.
So leaping ahead, when we get to Newman, is there a sort of deluge of Catholic writing post Newman? I mean, he effected a very profound change, didn't he?
He did. I mean, he inspired so many, and the Oxford movement, which was sort of aligned with him at the beginning, it caused so much interest in Catholicism, and there was so much that came up. So I think yes, he did inspire a lot of people. And of course, there was a huge literary revival in the 19th and 20th centuries in the Catholic faith. So, I mean, what springs to mind, perhaps wrongly with regard to Newman, is the tragic generation, which were the group that met in the pub that Yeats called them the tragic generation. And that was Oscar Wilde and Francis Thompson, Ernest Dowson, and Lionel Johnson. And that they all converted to the faith. And then later, of course, you've got the novelists in the 20th century like Graham Greene and Moore. So it was a very fruitful time for the Catholic literary tradition.
Okay, well, I did sort of tell you in advance that I had a clever idea. I think it's a clever idea anyway. We are going to read something from the book. I think this is a stunning poem for lots of reasons, not all of them just the poem itself. And we're going to do this in the spirit of your friend and mine, Pele Cox, who has done so many kind of online poetry readings where we all read in the round. So I'm going to invite you to begin. We'll talk a little bit about it, well, afterwards. Upon the death of, is that Monsignor Edmund Campion?
No, I think it's
just Mr. Edmund Campion, one of the Society of the Holy Name of Jesus. So quite a long title there. This is by Saint Henry Walpole. Well, just introduce it before we start.
So Edmund Campion, who the poem is about, he was a Catholic priest who was martyred, so he was killed, and that meant at the time hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, which is in London. And at his execution, there was a young man called Henry Walpole, and he was actually.
Is this Elizabeth I?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Henry Walpole was spattered with blood at the execution of Edmund Campion, and this kind of spurred him on to become a Catholic priest himself, and he was ultimately martyred himself and hanged, drawn and quartered. So it was also the next poem in the anthology is Robert Southwell, and the same thing happened to him. They all had to. The young men that went away and became Catholic priests, they were kind of sent back or decided to go back and in hiding kind of preach and minister the sacraments to the faithful, and they were hunted down and tortured and asked to sign the oath of supremacy, which meant that Elizabeth I was head of the church and in charge of all religious matters, and when they refused, they were killed. So it was just awful. And Edmund Campion, he published something called the 10 Reasons, and it was basically a list of things about the Catholic faith and saying how true it was, etc. And whilst he was being tortured, he was allowed time between being tortured to debate with Anglican theologians about those 10 reasons. I mean, it was just horrendous. However, we mustn't forget that the Catholics did terrible things too. When the boot was on the other foot, when another queen came into power. So it just beggars belief, doesn't it? Really, what people got up to. It just it's really horrible. And these methods of killing were appalling. I mean, really gross.
Let's dive in. We're going to alternate stanzas, and if you would begin, Sally, that would be lovely.
Okay. England, look up. Thy soil is stained with blood. Thou hast made martyrs many of thine own. If thou hast grace, their deaths will do thee good. The seed will take which in such blood is sown, and Campions learning fertile so before, thus watered too, must needs of force be more.
The tower saith the truth he did defend. The bar bears witness of his guiltless mind. Tyburn doth tell he made a patient end. On every gate his martyrdom we find. In vain you wrought that which would obscure his name, for heaven and earth will still record that same.
His prison now, the city of the king, his rack and torture, joys and heavenly bliss. For men's reproach with angels he doth sing, a sacred song which everlasting is. For shame but short and loss of small renown, he purchase hath an ever-during crown.
His quartered limbs shall join with joy again, and rise a body brighter than the sun. Your blinded malice tortured him in vain, for every wrench some glory hath him won, and every drop of blood which he did spend hath reaped a joy which never shall have end.
Can dreary death then daunt our faith or pain? Is't a lingering life we fear to lose or ease? No, no, such death procureth life again. 'Tis only God we tremble to displease, who kills but once, and ever still we die, whose hot revenge torments eternally.
We cannot fear a mortal torment. This martyr's blood hath moistened all our hearts, whose parted quarters when we chance to see, we learn to play the constant Christian's parts. His head doth speak, and heavenly precepts give, how we that look should frame ourselves to live.
His youth instructs us how to spend our days. His flying bids us how to vanish sin. His straight profession shows the narrow ways, which they must walk that look to enter in. His home return by danger and distress, emboldens us our conscience to profess.
His hurdle draws us with him to the cross. His speeches there provoke us for to die. His death doth say this life is but a loss. His martyred blood from heaven to us doth cry. His first and last, and all conspire in this, to show the way that leadeth unto bliss.
Blessed be God, which lent him so much grace. Thanked be Christ, which blessed his martyr so. Happy is he, which sees his master's face. Cursed are they that thought to work him woe. Bounden be we to give eternal praise to Jesus' name, which such a man did raise. Amen.
Amen. I mean, it's so extraordinary, that poem. I mean, just a line like, on every gate his martyrdom we find. That's the pieces of his body, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. And also, I think his writing, which was kind of pinned up everywhere as well. They would publish these treatises that these men would write, and they would be sort of spread about through London. And I think after he was killed, I think I'm right in saying that they kind of nailed up his 10 reasons and stuff. So I think it might also refer to that.
Right. And you know, his head doth speak. I mean, this was a time when the head would be displayed.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking as well. It would have been on a pole, wouldn't it, outside the tower or something, or at Tyburn? Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, did Walpole write more, or was that an example of, you know, some people just write one amazing poem?
Yeah. Do you know, I think I'd have to check. I have to double check. I think he did write more. But I think it's amazingly good. I mean, like, you know, anything else aside, isn't it a very good poem? It's a very good, solid poem. It's amazing how literary these men were, and in such under such enormous pressure to write in such form. I think is amazing.
I want to move to your own poetry now, leaving the anthology aside for the moment. I think you studied at UEA, didn't you?
No, I didn't. That was Pele.
Oh, right. Okay. You didn't. You didn't meet Pele at UEA then. Oh, okay. So tell me about. Did you study with Roddy Lumsden?
I did. Yeah, I did.
Great Roddy Lumsden. Yeah.
Yeah. Bless him. Yeah. So basically, I was a nurse, a psychiatric nurse, and I went to South Dakota, strangely enough, to do a master's. And I mean, the reasons being, you know, complicated, but some friends of mine invited me to go there for a year as a kind of sabbatical to do a master's in English and creative writing, which I did. And then I came back to London and was in Roddy Lumsden's workshop, and that was where I met Pele Cox.
Oh, right. Amongst
others, Catherine Simmons, for example. And Roddy was really wonderful, and he was a great champion of my work. Actually, he was very helpful and you know, and a great mentor.
I think some of the poems in your first collection are set on the plains, aren't they? Or
yeah,
you know, you use them as a kind of imaginative backdrop.
Yeah, they're set in America on the plains, and also in Italy, because then I moved to Sardinia, which is where my husband was based at the time, and then in Rome. So it's like my writing's always about three different countries: America and England and Italy. They're my kind of my backdrops, yeah, as you say.
So the first collection, how did it come about? Was it easy to get into print? So this is 2005.
Yeah. Gosh, it seems like a very long time ago.
Yeah.
Well, I was very fortunate because I won an Eric Gregory Award, and those awards are very fortunate because they do get you noticed. And so I think it was really that Roddy spoke to Neil Astley, because Roddy really liked my work, and I'm sure it was through Roddy. So Neil published those 3 books, and then once I'd had the conversion, I took a very long time to write another collection, and Blood X didn't want the kind of the religious element, so I got it published by 2 publishers, one in Britain and one in America, and that came out after 10 years of writing.
Would you like to read some of your own poetry now?
Sure.
You know, from one of these collections.
Yeah. So,
or I mean, I've got these 3. I've got the 3 Blood Axe ones. So,
yeah.
Yes, your choice. But I mean, they're all amazing. I mean, the Day Hospital has a lot about your experiences as a psychiatric nurse.
The Day Hospital is monologues, and they're much longer. So what I thought I'd do is read one from the very, very first book, The Point of Splitting, and then read one from the most recent collection of poetry. So this is Instruction. This is the one that people tend to like, which is and it's about my experience when I was a nurse of when somebody died, you had to wash them and then wrap them up in a sheet to be carried away.
Can I just say, before you begin, I would like to dedicate your reading of this poem, which I reread only the other day, to the memory of Robert Gaisford, who is a friend who died last week, and a wonderful, wonderful person, and actually a Catholic. So I might be in a bit of a mess by the time you've finished, but it is an amazing poem.
Okay, all right then. Instruction. Check. Water. Soap. A folded sheet. A shroud. Close cubicle curtains. Lights swallowed in hospital green. Our man lies dense with gravity. An arm, his head, at angles, as if dropped from a great height. There is a fogged mermaid from shoulder to wrist, nicotine-stained teeth, nails dug with dirt. A labourer then, one for the women. A smooth drain to ivory is overtaking from the feet. Wash him swiftly, praising in murmurs, like your mother used, undressing you when asleep. Dry carefully. If he complained at the damp when alive, dry again. Remove teeth, all tags. Rip off elastoplast. Careful now. Each cell is snuffing its lights, but black blood still spurts. Now, the shroud, opaque, choirboy rough. Fasten it on him, comb his hair to the right. Now, he could be anyone. Now wrap in the sheet, like a parcel, start at his feet. Swaddle, not tight, nor too loose. It's an art, sheathing this bundle of untied, heavy sticks. Hesitate before covering his face, bandaging warm, wet recesses of eyes, mouth. Your hands will prick, an animal sniffing last traces of life. Cradle the head, bind it with tape, and when it lolls lovingly against your chest, lower it gently as a bowl brimmed with water. Collect tags, teeth, wash bowl. Open the window, let the soul fly. Through green curtains the day will tear. Cabs, sun glare, rain. Remember to check. Tidied bed, emptied cabinet, sheeted form. Observe him recede to the flux between seconds, the slowness of sand. Don't loiter. Slide back into the ward's slipstream. Pick up your pace immediately.
It's a very tender poem. It's an extraordinary
poem.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Dear, oh dear. Yeah. It's
yeah. He wasn't a labourer. He was actually a lawyer. So,
I'm very sorry.
I don't think he had tattoos, but yeah. Is there anything?
Bit more cheerful.
You wouldn't? Well, yes, we can be cheerful. I mean, how does a poem come to you? I mean, is it after a lot of experience you think I can distill this, or is it an extraordinary experience that you must immediately write about?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think it's changed over time, and I think that when I first started writing poetry, it was almost like I viewed the whole of life as a possible subject for a poem. So if something happened, I would immediately try and write it down. I think these days, because I write so much prose, then when a poem comes knocking, it's something that I just really, really feel called to write. And I write poems much less frequently than I used to. So I think it's changed a lot. And it's things that kind of come to me out of nowhere more these days. Whereas I think in the old Roddy Lumsden days in the workshop, I was busy kind of writing poems for the workshop and looking around for ideas. I suppose I consider myself less as a kind of professional poet in that sense now, because I write, as I say, my last few books have been prose, and I've got another prose book coming out next year. So, poetry is less frequent.
And does it come easier now? I mean, is it sort of done in one session, or do you sort of tinker with things for a long time?
No, it takes ages. And I think the awful thing is that, you can think a poem's done and then you read it a year later and you think, oh, it's just dreadful. And it takes a whole other load of revision, that's just me. I don't know whether everyone's like that, but it takes me years before I could be sure that it's done. Yeah.
And what do you think of the collections? Are you pretty sure they're all, they've all set like concrete? I suppose, I mean, the thing about looking back is that you just become a different person anyway. And you can't go back to what you were when you wrote something, a decade ago.
You can't. I think that they are done in that sense. They really are. Mm-hmm. It's a bit strange because there is so much also about like Virgin Mary and stuff in the early books, but often in a very heretical sense, and there was a bit of tension there sometimes, and I do worry sometimes that some of my readers who come to me through the religious work, they'll go and look at the early work and they'll be shocked witless. There's that constant tension, and it's nice to feel integrated sometimes and be able to talk about things. I like doing this for example, because I can talk about the whole journey, because of course the early work exists and you can't negate it. You shouldn't disrespect it, and I think that just goes to show how your early experiences form you.
So let's go on to another poem from the latest collection. That's
so kind of a nativity type of thing as we're coming up towards Christmas, basically.
Yes.
So this is called His Face, and I write an awful lot of poems about the Virgin Mary and her maternity, and this is just about the Virgin Mary with the Christ child. His face. His body is swaddled head to foot, but his face is a window, one small pool of light. This nakedness that even Adam would not cover is a tender dish of listening, hunger in the nuzzling nose and petal mouth, a sense of awe in the here and now, and dizzy distance, like that one star announcing the expanse of night. Lady, see the depths of his dark eyes. This locked gaze is what keeps God and man together. It is true prayer, he holding fast to your face like a constellated sky, you tumbling softly into him with no lights but those eyes.
Wonderful. That also reminds me, I think quite early on in this book, there's there's a lot of male writers in the anthology, isn't there? And there's a rather wonderful poem. I'm just trying to find it. Is it the Clement of Alexandria? Oh yes, A Hymn to Christ the Saviour. Sometimes some of so yes, I'm babbling a bit, but your own motherhood means a lot to you in this sense, and the link with the Virgin. But there is some extraordinarily tender writing from men about the Virgin Mary, and I suppose what I'm getting at is this idea that it's a way of accessing the feminine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's also a really early one, Ephraim as well. He writes, there's a lovely one about the nativity, hymns on the nativity of Christ in the flesh, where he says, your mother is a wonder. And it's amazing how important, obviously, to Catholics Mary is, but you can see it like in the very, very early writing, how he says like the Lord entered her and became a servant. And it's like she's this kind of country where she manages to turn everything on its head. It's really, really amazing. Yeah, there's a lot of tenderness there. And I did work actually hard to get lots of women in. And I think actually considering that it goes from the year dot, there are quite a lot of women, really, especially in the early times, like, Mechtild and Hildegard and all that lot, were sort of quite represented. And they were so innovative.
Well, I want to move on to art because, one of the questions that I ask is favourite artwork, but it seems in your case that's an especially pertinent question because I think you are very influenced by art and by religious art, aren't you? And I mean, living in Rome, you're surrounded by it. What means the most to you?
Well, yeah, this is interesting. And actually, but the book that's coming out next year is called The Mary Pages. And it's about my relationship with the Virgin Mary and how she's come to me through art. So I talk about a lot of religious art through the whole book. And each section is there's a central artistic work for each section. And so they include Fra Lippi's Madonna and Child with Two Angels, Raphael's The Madonna of Granduca, the Pietà by Michelangelo, and then the Madonna of Guadalupe and the Madonna of Walsingham. So those images are really central to the whole book. So yeah, I mean, artwork to me is incredibly important.
You have a lovely image on the cover, actually. I was delighted to see that you have Botticelli, who was a very interesting figure himself in terms of, the pagan influences on his work, but also the fact that he came under the influence of Savonarola, and apparently burnt some of his artworks anyway.
Yes,
Is he a particularly important? I mean, did you choose that cover image?
No, I didn't. They did it, and I couldn't be happier. Like, I think it's just a brilliant cover. It's a detail from the Madonna of Magnificat, and the Magnificat is the first poem. It's the only piece of scripture in the anthology.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, you had to sort of think about the Bible, didn't you? I mean, how much to include or not to include, because the Psalms.
Exactly. Yeah.
Poetry, I suppose.
Yeah. So I had to I drew the line and said no biblical poems, because it would have all have been biblical poems, and you've got the Bible for that. So I just start off with the Magnificat to just in homage to the Bible, and then Mary was the first Catholic poet.
Also, when you're writing, when you're compiling an anthology like this, are there other Catholic anthologies out there? Are there other things that you thought, well, that's been done, so I don't want to do it quite like that?
Right. As I hesitate, because there's always somebody to prove you wrong, but I don't think that this has been done before. There are Catholic anthologies, like, for instance, from 1800 perhaps to the present, or contemporary, but I don't believe that there's one that goes from the year dot through to the end of the 20th century in this way. So this is a groundbreaker. So I know I didn't. I looked at other anthologies that are of Christian poetry to see what they'd got. So that was interesting. Yeah. But no, this was new.
Another thing that you've done that is innovative is that every selection has an essay. I think that's probably what must have taken most of the work.
Yeah.
And it's why it's sort of such a chunky book. Why did you choose to do that rather than here's some poetry, read at your leisure?
Well, again, it was the publisher that asked me. This was their vision. Okay. And really it's about, Word on Fire. It's that what they're doing is they're introducing people to the literary tradition and to the artistic tradition. They want Catholics to understand what they've got, and so many people are frightened of poetry. And they just think, oh, well, I just can't understand it, or it's boring, or whatever. And I think it could have been dull, but I like to think that the way I've done it is that what I did was I gave people a historical context, or the context of the poet's life, like why did they write it, what's the story, and then talk a little bit about the poem itself, and kind of just give people something to focus on as they read to make it understandable. And I think that's made it really interesting. I mean, I asked my daughter at the very beginning, I said, okay, if you wanted to read a commentary about a poem, what should I put in? What should it say? And she said, you've got to give people the tea, which is what the young people say for gossip. So like, therefore, like with the Ballad of Reading Jail, you've got to get the tea, like, well, why did he write it? Where was he? What was going on? You've got to give people the story,
Yeah. And I believe it's sold out already. Is that the first edition has sold out? And
long before Christmas, I'm like, oh gosh, it has. It went very, very quickly. So anyway, if you can pre-order it, and the new copies will be in January.
I mean, there couldn't be a better indication that it's needed and wanted as a piece of work. It is rather thrilling. Although people are not now going to be able to get it for their Christmas present. You're also doing an event in London, aren't you? In a few days' time. What will that?
Yeah, that's St Patrick's in Soho Square, and it's a lecture. This organisation called the Guild of Our Lady of Ransom, they have lectures, I think 2 or 3 times a year. So I'll be giving the lecture about poetry and stuff like that, and speaking a little bit about my story, and there'll be questions and answers, etc.
Excellent. Okay, well, I will move on to my final questions now. So the first one, back to art. Favourite artwork?
Well, okay, so I always find these questions very difficult. Obviously, now I'd like to say this. I'm going to cheat here. I feel like the answer I should say is Caravaggio's La Madonna dei Pellegrini, which is a beautiful Caravaggio, which I'm lucky enough to be able to see regularly in Rome, because it's hanging up in Sant'Agostino Church near Piazza Navona. And it's the one of the pilgrims have come up to find the Christ child, and they're kneeling on the step, and she's come out, this beautiful, beautiful Mary, who was actually, I think probably the model was Lena, Caravaggio's lover. And she's kind of got a head on the side, and she's got the Christ child on her hip. And it's the chiaroscuro, so it's all kind of very lit. And then there's the darkness, and her dress is kind of dark red and dark blue, and it's just so beautifully lit. So that's what I would say. But am I allowed to say another one or not?
Yes, go on.
Okay, because I feel like at the moment, for some strange reason, I'm just very, very drawn to Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna of the Rocks, which is in the National Gallery.
Yes.
And I
see that regularly. Yes.
Yeah, and it's really weird, because I feel that it's almost repellent, because it's so dank and so kind of deathly looking, but there's something just so appealing about it. And I can't figure out why there's something so attractive about it.
Yes, I don't know why she's among rocks, unless Leonardo just thought, I want to paint rocks almost more than I want to paint figures. I think there's some kind of idea behind it of ancientness,
it's also like
geological time.
Yeah, the skin color of the Madonna and the child, and John the Baptist, I think, is in there too, isn't he? The skin color is grey, and they look kind of slightly deathly and kind of sleepy. And I think there's just something hypnotic about it. They all look very kind of heavy. I'm not making it sound very appealing, but I find it just incredibly beautiful.
Yes, as a composition. And there's also, he had another go at it, and I can't remember which came first, but there's one in the Louvre and that has an angel with this amazing sort of pointing, sort of like that, this incredible hand. And they sort of feel like they mean slightly different things. I don't think he was particularly mystical, but he was certainly kind of intellectual, and there's something intellectual going on in both those paintings. And the cartoon as well, the big cartoon also in the National Gallery is a fabulous piece of work as well. So great, Leonardo, we love that. Right, Book of Shame, something missing from your reading. What would that be?
Well, if you'd have asked me just over a year ago, I would have had to have said Middlemarch or Bleak House, but I actually read both of those last year, which I'm really proud of. So I'd have to say War and Peace, but I think that's kind of almost for everybody, almost. Yeah. So I'm going to say The Lord of the Rings, because I've never read it, and for a Catholic who's very much working for the Catholic literary tradition, that's a crime, and people will be shocked because he's big in Catholic circles, and it's just not my cup of tea.
Well done. That is a true book of shame. Shame.
You make me feel even worse.
Well, I mean, he did like to write all this poetry, which is sort of doggerel. I mean, there are lots of wonderful things in The Lord of the Rings, but you can definitely skip the poetry. Okay, I'm going to absolve you. I think that's absolutely fine. What was it like reading Middlemarch? I mean, you must have heard so much about it, like best novel ever written kind of thing. Did it enchant, disappoint?
It did enchant. I mean, that's right. Martin Amis said it was the best novel ever written in the English language. It did enchant. I loved it. And there were so many characters in it and things in it, and I'm so glad that I know, because I've heard so many references to it. Right. Do I think it's the best novel in the English language? I don't know. I don't know about that. It's like they say that Bleak House is the best Dickens. I'm just not so sure. I think I'm not a big novel person in a sense. I do like to read them sometimes, but I think I'm very much more on the miniature scale. Right. And like my favorite Dickens is Our Mutual Friend.
Oh, I mean, it's still a big novel, isn't it?
It's not as big as Bleak House.
Yeah. Oh, I do absolutely love Bleak House, and I read it as a teenager, but definitely in the mood that Dickens was quite hard work, and it was too much like things we were studying. And I think a friend was just so absorbed in it that I thought, well, I'll give it a go, and you know, probably read it about 6 times, and I'm due another one fairly soon.
Wow, gosh.
Yeah, I just love it, and it still has. I mean, the mark of a great book is where you just think, oh, I've never really noticed that detail before, or other things kind of come out and strike you. I mean, the great set pieces, but also, I mean, the other thing is you know, actually the mechanics of the plot, which, I mean, Dickens is just fantastic on.
Yeah.
You know, keeping control of everything. Amazing. Okay, so finally, it's the feedback question. Have you ever had any bizarre or puzzling or funny feedback on your work?
Well, you know, funnily enough, considering that there's quite a lot of sex in my first book, and there's certainly a lot of religion in the later books, I would have expected to have had more weird responses. But I really haven't. You know, in terms of readers getting in touch, I've had a lot of just very sane and lovely people, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, when I was first living in Italy, I had my poetry translated into Italian, and I thought to myself, oh, this is great. Like, oh, you know, this is the beginning of me being integrated into the Italian literary scene. And I went to meet my translator in Rome, and he's a lovely bloke who's extremely talented, Andrea Sirotti. We had a lovely time. And then we were sitting outside this university where we were going to be going for a meeting. And he said to me, you know, he said, just to bear in mind that for a lot of Italian intellectuals, your work will be considered banal, because it's very much about the body and it's about the concrete. And he said, I don't find it banal. I think it's great. But just to bear in mind, they might find that very difficult. And I was like, oh, okay. And then we met.
That is the classic. Some people would say your work isn't any good. I wouldn't say that.
But he translated the work, so I think he was genuine in that in his admiration. But then what happened was I met a professoressa at this Rome university, and she was lovely to me and really liked me. And she was like, oh, send me your work, and I'll introduce you to all these different people, and I'll get you in on everything, you know. And I sent her my book, The Point of Splitting, and I never heard from her. So I wrote to her and I said, did you get my book? And she just wrote and said, yes, I got your book. And I have told everyone about you. But it was really obvious that it was just very negative. And I think it really was about the fact that, you know, that work is very, very physical and quite shocking in some ways. And I think for the Italians, that was just, they really just considered that, you know, if you're intellectual in Italy, it's quite highfalutin. And they kind of perhaps prefer the abstract over the concrete.
Yeah. I mean, you'd often get that from sort of questions posed at literary events. I mean, I find sort of Europe generally, the questions are of a very sort of high intellectual nature. It's quite interesting to see that. Okay, wow. Right, so you wouldn't be sending any updates on your work.
I've drawn a line. Draw a line,
but maybe this will rehabilitate you in some way. Okay, brilliant. So nice to chat to you as ever, Sally. Good luck with everything. Good luck with the new book coming out next year, and good luck with the reprint of the already very successful 100 Great Catholic Poems. Thank you for joining me in the book bag.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for watching. Yet again, 100 Great Catholic Poems. Really fascinating. I'm going to dedicate this whole episode to my friend Robert Gaisford. Lovely, lovely man. And he would have absolutely adored this book. I do know that. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time with somebody else. Very fun and very interesting in my book bag. Thank you. Bye.